Claude responded. I was halfway through recaning an old porch chair when my phone buzzed on the workbench, and my daughter's name lit up the screen with a message that started. I was halfway through recaning an old porch chair when my phone buzzed on the workbench, and my daughter's name lit up the screen with a message that started. Dad, before you RSVP to the shower, there's something you need to sign first. I set the chair down and read the whole thing standing up, because some sentences you can't absorb sitting down. My name is Walter Ambrose. Everyone on my street calls me Walt. I'm 64 years old, and I spent 36 years as a machinist at a tool and die shop outside Toledo, Ohio. The kind of work that leaves permanent grease lines in the creases of your knuckles no soap has ever fully solved. I retired 2 years ago when the shop finally closed for good. My wife, Loretta Lowe, to everyone who's ever loved her, has been telling me for a decade that my hands deserved a rest. I told her I'd think about it. She'd already cleared out my old locker before I agreed. We live on Birchwood Lane in a town called Fenimore, in a house I rewired and re-shingled myself over the years, one room and one weekend at a time. The porch step still sticks a little in humid weather. I've meant to plane it down since spring. None of that mattered tonight. It had been an ordinary Thursday. Lowe was folding towels at the kitchen table, the radio playing something from the 70s low enough to hum along to without really singing. I was on the porch with the chair and a coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. Our daughter, Marissa, 31 years old, expecting her first child in 6 weeks, married to a man named Preston Cale who worked in commercial insurance and always shook my hand a half-second too firmly, like he was still deciding if I passed inspection. I read the message twice, then walked it into the kitchen and set the phone face up on the table in front of Lowe. Marissa sent something, I said. About the baby shower. Lowe dried her hands on her apron and picked up the phone without much urgency. Marissa sent long messages the way some people send postcards, casually, constantly. But her face changed about 4 lines in, and I watched 40 years of reading that face tell me everything before she said a single word. Walter, she said quietly. There's an attachment. The attachment was a document. 22 numbered items. Marissa had titled it, in careful bold font, Guidelines for Grandparent Participation. Item 1. Grandparents were not to hold the baby for longer than 15 minutes at a time during any visit to avoid, in Preston's words, over-attachment before boundaries are established. Item 2. Lowe and I were to complete an online parenting philosophy course that Preston's mother had recommended and submit certificates of completion before we would be permitted at the hospital. Item 3. No unsolicited advice regarding feeding, sleep training, or discipline under any circumstances for the child's first 2 years of life. I set my coffee down. It had gone from lukewarm to something I no longer felt like drinking. Item 7 made my jaw tighten in a way I hadn't felt since my own father's funeral. It said that I was not permitted to teach the child anything related to manual trades or blue-collar work without prior written approval, because Preston wanted their son exposed to a wider range of professional aspirations from the start. I read that sentence 4 times. 36 years of machining precision parts that held airplanes together, and my own daughter's husband had put in writing that my life's work needed prior approval before I could mention it to my grandson. Item 12 required us to refer to Preston's parents, Richard and Carol Cale, as Grandma Carol and Grandpa Richard in all settings, while Lowe and I would be introduced simply as Walter and Loretta, no honorific, to avoid what the document called confusion around primary grandparent roles. Item 15 said any gifts for the baby needed to be pre-approved by Marissa and Preston jointly, submitted through a registry link, with handmade items specifically excluded because Preston's mother had, in the document's words, concerns about safety compliance with non-manufactured items. I looked up from the phone. Lowe had gone very still at the table, a folded towel resting forgotten in her lap. Walt, she said. Item 19. Item 19 stated that at the baby shower itself, in 3 weeks, Lowe and I would be seated at what the document called the extended family table, positioned near the coat check, separate from the immediate family table where Richard and Carol would sit alongside Marissa and Preston. I had built furniture with my own 2 hands that families ate holiday dinners on for 20 years. I had never once in 64 years of living been assigned a coat check table by my own child. Lo set the towel down slowly. "There's a 20-second item," she said. "It says we need to sign and return the document within 5 days confirming our agreement, or our attendance will be," and I'm reading this exactly, "respectfully reconsidered." Neither of us said anything for a while. The radio kept playing. Somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something that didn't matter to anyone but the dog. "Respectfully reconsidered," I finally repeated. "That's a fancy way of saying disinvited." Lo didn't answer. She got up, walked to the sink, and stood there with the water running over her hands even though there was nothing in them to wash. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Lo, listening to her breathe, that particular shallow rhythm she has when she's awake and pretending not to be. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, I got up and went out to the garage, because that's where I've always gone to think since before Marissa was born. The garage smells the way it smelled for 30 years, cutting oil, sawdust, the dry warmth of a space heater running through a cold night. My workbench runs the length of the back wall, tools hung on pegboard I installed. The same month we brought Marissa home from the hospital, each wrench and file in the exact spot my hands expect to find it in the dark. I sat on the old stool and let the quiet do what it does. After a while I started talking to the room, the way a man does when he's spent enough decades alone with machines that don't answer back. 36 years, I said to no one. 36 years of getting up at 5, driving 40 minutes each way in every kind of Ohio weather, coming home with metal shavings in my collar and a paycheck that put braces on my daughter's teeth and new tires on the car that got her to her first job interview. I thought about the summer Marissa was 19 and called home crying because her community college financial aid had fallen through 3 weeks before the semester started. Lo and I had a savings account we'd started the year Marissa was born, money set aside a little at a time for exactly this kind of emergency. We wired her the balance the next morning. She never asked where it came from. 19-year-olds rarely do. I thought about the year after that, when Marissa and her first boyfriend split badly, and she moved back home for 4 months, and Lo cooked dinner every night for a young woman who barely spoke, until one evening Marissa finally cried into her mother's shoulder at the kitchen sink and said she didn't know how she'd have survived it without us. She'd said that 4 years ago. I remembered it clearly, because Lo had cried about it privately for a week afterward, moved by how much her daughter had needed her. How do you go from that kitchen to a document with 22 numbered rules and a coat check table? I asked the tools on the wall. The tools didn't answer. Tools rarely do. But something in my chest had gone hard and cold in a way that felt less like anger and more like standing at the top of a staircase in the dark and suddenly understanding that a step you'd trusted your whole life wasn't where you thought it was. I heard Lo's slippers on the kitchen floor above and knew she was up. I stood, and as I did, my hand caught the corner of an old cedar chest I'd built the same year we bought this house. The one that sat under the workbench, holding spare hardware and out-of-season tools. The impact knocked the lid ajar, and something slid off the top shelf inside and landed with a soft thud. It was a small ledger book, the kind with a marbled cover, worn soft at the corners. Lo's handwriting was on the front in her careful, deliberate cursive, the handwriting she only used for things that mattered. One word: Marissa. I'd never seen it before in my life. I picked it up carefully, the way you handle something fragile before your mind is caught up with what your hands already know. The first page was dated April, the year Marissa turned 7. Lo's small, neat entries began simply: skip the new winter coat this year. Put the difference, $60, into Marissa's account. She needs new shoes for the spring recital. I turned the page. October, same year. Walter picked up 2 extra weekend shifts at the shop, took the overtime and moved it into the account without telling him I was tracking it separately. He'd tell me not to bother. He'd be wrong. My throat closed up so hard I had to set the ledger on my knee and press the back of my hand against my mouth. For 24 years, my wife had been sitting somewhere in this house, the kitchen table, the porch, maybe right here in this garage while I was on shift, writing down every dollar she'd quietly set aside for our daughter. Every sacrifice, itemized in patient cursive. I kept turning pages. March, the year Marissa turned 12, sold my grandmother's cameo brooch at the pawn shop on Route 20, got $90. Told Walter I lost it cleaning out the attic. He believed me. Marissa needs braces, and I couldn't watch him take on more overtime. Further along, an entry from the year Marissa was 15. Walter's working the night shift again. Made soup and ate alone. That's fine. Marissa called from her friend's house and sounded happy. That's what matters. I closed the ledger and sat with it shut on my knee for a long time. When I finally opened it again, I turned to the last written page. Lowe had drawn a single line beneath the final entry, and below it, in larger letters, as if she wanted this part legible decades from now, she'd written, total, 24 years, $31,400. This is not a debt. I am not writing this so anyone repays it. I am writing it so I remember I did right by my daughter, that whatever happens, I chose her over and over when she never knew a choice was being made. If you're reading this, Walt, I'm sorry I didn't tell you. You would have tried to stop me, and I couldn't let you stop me. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. My eyes burned the way eyes burn when a man is fighting something too large to let out cleanly, and I pressed my knuckles against my mouth hard enough to feel my teeth through the skin. But I didn't cry. I folded the ledger, slid it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, right against my heart, and walked into the kitchen where Lo was pouring coffee like it was any other Friday morning. "Morning ready?" she asked, not turning around. "Be right there," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. I didn't tell her I'd found it. Not yet. There was something I needed to build first. That evening I told Lo I was going to make something for the baby. She looked at the 22-item document still sitting on the kitchen counter and reminded me, gently, that handmade gifts were excluded under item 15. "I know what item 15 says," I told her. She was quiet a moment. Then she asked what I had in mind. I had a piece of black walnut in the garage, set aside 2 winters ago without a clear purpose, the kind of board a craftsman holds back because it's too good to waste on something ordinary. Tight, straight grain, dark heartwood with a deep reddish cast that only walnut carries. I'd been saving it for something that mattered. I hadn't known what, until now. I spent that Saturday and Sunday building a small keepsake chest, 12 inches by 9, deep enough to hold a ledger and a stack of photographs. I cut the corners with hand-fitted dovetail joints, the kind that lock stronger than any nail or screw ever could. I sanded it through 4 grits until the walnut felt like water under your palm. I carved the inscription into the lid myself, slow and deliberate. "For our grandson, from the people who came first." I lined the interior with a scrap of blue velvet from an old jewelry box Lo said she had no more use for. I placed the ledger inside on the right. On the left, I placed photographs I'd pulled from a shoebox in the hall closet Marissa at 6 on my shoulders at the county fair. Marissa, at 15, laughing so hard at something Lo said that milk nearly came out her nose. Marissa at her college graduation with both of us crying happier than we'd ever admit out loud. Then I wrote a short letter in my plainest handwriting. "Marissa, I am not bringing this to embarrass you or start trouble at your shower. I am bringing it because I am your father, and I have been your father for 31 years, and that doesn't stop because of a document with 22 rules on it. Inside this box is something your mother made for you over 24 years. She never showed it to me. I found it by accident. I think you should know what it says before your son grows up not knowing it either." I folded the letter, laid it on top of the ledger, closed the lid, and latched the small brass clasp I'd installed the night before. Lo appeared in the garage doorway. She looked at the chest for a long moment, her hand rising slowly to cover her mouth. "Oh, Walt," she said, and her voice cracked clean down the middle. "It's just a box," I said, though my own throat had gone tight enough that I had to look at the workbench instead of her face. Our neighbor Gary Petrocelli came by that Monday morning with his second cup of coffee and the particular look of a man who'd been chewing on something since before sunrise. Gary and his wife Donna had lived next door for 31 years, the exact number of years I'd been a father, which had always struck me as a strange kind of coincidence. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the walnut chest sitting on the table. "That's a beautiful piece of work, Walt," he said, and meant it. I told him the plan. Lo and I would drive to Columbus that Saturday for the shower, held at a banquet hall Preston's family had booked, a place called the Whitmore Room. We'd arrive when instructed, sit at the extended family table near the coat check, and not make a scene. But I'd asked my cousin's son, a young man named Denny who did some part-time work for the venue's catering company and had been invited as a family friend on Preston's side, if he'd carry the walnut chest in and set it on the gift table without announcing where it came from. Denny had agreed, without hesitation. Gary listened to all of it, then set his coffee down hard enough that it clinked against the table. "Donna and I want to come," he said. I hadn't expected that. Nobody had invited them. "Gary, don't Gary me," he said. "I've watched Marissa grow up on this street since she was in diapers. I've watched what's happened to this family the last 3 years, and I've kept my mouth shut when I shouldn't have. I'm done keeping it shut." He told me things that afternoon I hadn't known. That 2 months ago, Donna had been walking her dog past Marissa and Preston's house and seen Lo's car in the driveway. Lo had driven over with a casserole because Marissa had come down with the flu in her second trimester. Donna had watched Preston's mother, Carol, meet Lo at the door, take the dish with a tight smile, and then, 20 minutes after Lo pulled away, walk to the side of the house and empty the entire casserole into the trash can before rinsing the dish clean with the garden hose. Donna wasn't sure what she was seeing at first, Gary said. She thought maybe there was a reason. But she watched it happen, Walt. She's not a woman who imagines things. I sat very still with that information settling into me like cold water finding the bottom of a glass. There was more. 6 weeks earlier, Gary had been trimming his hedge near the fence line and overheard Preston and Marissa in their driveway. Preston had said, clear as anything, that his parents needed to be seated up front at the shower, that it would look off to have Richard and Carol anywhere but the head table, and that Marissa's parents could sit wherever made sense given the room. Marissa didn't argue, Gary said quietly. She just said, "Okay, I'll figure out the seating." I thought about 31 years of watching my daughter grow into a thoughtful, generous young woman. And I thought about a document with 22 numbered rules, and something in me went very quiet and very resolved, the way water goes still right before it freezes. "What are you going to do?" Gary asked. I thought about the walnut chest sitting on my kitchen table, and the ledger inside it, and $31,400 written in careful cursive on the last page. "I'm going to let the truth walk into that room," I said. "I'm not going to carry it in myself. I'm just not going to stop it anymore." We drove to Columbus on Saturday morning, Lo quiet beside me with her travel mug in both hands, watching the highway the way she does when she's thinking through something she isn't ready to say aloud yet. Somewhere past Marion, she finally spoke. "Do you think she'll look at us when we walk in?" she asked. "Marissa, do you think she'll actually see us?" I didn't have a good answer, so I told her the truth. "I don't know, Lo. I keep wondering that myself." The Whitmore room was exactly the kind of venue Preston's family favored. Soft gold lighting, white orchid centerpieces, a chalkboard sign near the entrance reading, "Welcome to Baby Kale's shower," in elegant script. A young woman checked our names against a list and directed us, with practiced pleasantness, to a small round table near the coat check. 4 chairs, positioned close enough to the door that every arriving guest's cold air reached us first. Gary and Donna were already seated with us when we arrived, having driven separately. Gary caught my eye and gave one small nod. The walnut chest, I noted, glancing across the room, sat near the far end of the gift table, its carved lid catching the light from the chandeliers. Whatever was going to happen next was already in motion. The shower proceeded the way showers do, games, cooing over tiny outfits, a slideshow of ultrasound photos that made Lo's hand find mine under the table without either of us deciding to reach for the other. Richard and Carol sat at a table near the front, close to Marissa and Preston, greeted warmly by nearly every arriving guest as the grandparents, while Lo and I were introduced, when introduced at all, simply as Walter and Loretta. I watched Preston's mother accept compliments about the nursery she'd apparently helped decorate. I watched Preston's father shake hands with a rhythm that suggested he'd shaken a great many hands in his life and enjoyed every one of them. I did not watch myself get angry, because I had decided in the garage 3 days earlier that anger wasn't going to be the thing I brought into that room. Gift opening began after cake. One by one, presents were unwrapped to warm applause, soft blankets, tiny shoes, a rocking chair from Carol and Richard that drew a long round of appreciative clapping and several photographs. Then Denny lifted the walnut chest and carried it to the front table. Marissa looked at it first with simple curiosity, then her expression shifted as her eyes caught the carved inscription. Preston leaned over to look, and I watched his jaw tighten by exactly 1 degree. "Who's this from?" Marissa asked, reaching for the small card tucked under the clasp. She read it silently. I watched her shoulders change a small, barely visible drop, the posture of someone releasing a held breath they hadn't realized they were holding. She opened the lid. On top sat my letter. She read it, her hand rising slowly to her mouth. Then she lifted the ledger out and turned it over, staring at the faded cover, her mother's handwriting spelling out her own name. "What is that?" Carol asked from beside her, craning to see. "It's my mother's," Marissa said quietly. Richard, seated at the head table, leaned across with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no at a party. "May I?" he said, already reaching, and took the ledger from Marissa's hands before she decided how to answer. He opened it to the first page. He read the date aloud, the way people do when filling a silence out of habit rather than intention. April. Skip the new winter coat this year. Put the difference into Marissa's account. The table nearest the front went quiet. He turned the page and kept reading, his voice losing its dinner party polish page by page, replaced by something more careful, more private, the voice of a man reading something he hadn't expected to move him. He reached the entry about the pawned cameo brooch. He reached the entry about soup eaten alone on a night shift. The quiet spread outward from that table the way ripples spread from a stone dropped in still water, guest by guest, until the whole room had gone still enough to hear the ice settling in the punch bowl. He read the final entry aloud, his voice thinning at the edges. Total, 24 years, $31,400. This is not a debt. He stopped. He stood there holding the ledger with both hands, looking at his son. And his face wasn't the face of a man performing anymore. It was the face of a man recalculating something he'd taken for granted his entire life, and finding the original number entirely wrong. Carol made a small sound behind her hand. Preston's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "This is a private family matter," Preston said, finding his voice, standing. "This wasn't meant to—" "I have something to say, if nobody minds," Gary said, rising from our table without waiting to be handed anything. He didn't need a microphone. 31 years directing traffic for the county road crew had given him a voice that carried on its own. "I've lived next door to Walter and Loretta Ambrose for 31 years, Gary said. "I watched Walt work double shifts so his daughter could go to community college. I watched Loretta sell her own grandmother's jewelry to help pay for braces, money she never told her husband about. And 2 months ago, I watched Carol Cale take a casserole Loretta made for her sick daughter and pour the whole thing into the trash before rinsing the dish clean. And the room turned, not all at once, but table by table, the way heads turn when people are quietly putting new information into place." Carol's face had gone very still. "I'm not saying this to embarrass anyone," Gary said. "I'm saying it because that man has been quiet a long time, too long. And the people who benefited from his quiet ought to know what it cost him." He sat back down. Donna reached over and squeezed his hand once, briefly, then let go. Preston's father set the ledger down on the gift table, his hand lingering on it as though unsure what to do with a hand that had just held something like that. He turned to his son. "Tell me honestly," he said, "when you wrote up that seating arrangement, what was your thinking?" Preston's throat moved. "It made sense for the room," he said, and even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded the moment it left him. Marissa was still holding the ledger, her fingers pressed white against its cover. She looked up, first at Preston, then across the room, and found me at the small table by the coat check. I didn't look away. I didn't say a word. I let my daughter look at her father and see whatever she needed to see. "I didn't know," Marissa said finally, to the room, to Preston, to no one in particular, about any of it. "I didn't know Mom sold anything. I didn't know Dad worked doubles for my braces." Her eyes filled. "Preston, I didn't know." "That doesn't change the arithmetic," Preston said, and I watched something in his own father's face fall at hearing him say it. "My parents are helping us start this life. Your parents, they're comfortable. They own their house. They can absorb things we can't. The room absorbed that sentence the way rooms absorb things too large for an immediate reaction. That is not the point, and you know it, Carol said suddenly, quietly, surprising everyone, including herself, it seemed. She looked at her son with an expression somewhere between disappointment and dawning recognition. Preston, whatever we can afford has nothing to do with what that woman gave up so your wife could have a life. I pushed my chair back. It wasn't dramatic. I simply stood, the way a man stands when he's sat long enough, and it's time to be upright again. Lo, I said. Let's go on home. She rose beside me without hesitation, the unhurried dignity of a woman with nothing left to prove to that room or any other. Gary and Donna stood at the same moment, without a word passing between us, because that's what neighbors do after 31 years. I looked at Marissa one last time before we turned for the door. You keep that ledger, I told her. It's yours now. It always was. We walked out into the cold Columbus afternoon, and behind us I heard Marissa's voice rising, urgent, saying Preston's name, and then the door swung shut and there was only the sound of traffic and Lo's arm tucked tight through mine. We got home to Fenimore a little after 8 that night. Gary's porch light was already on, the way it always was, and I found that steadying the way I always had. Marissa called 3 days later. She was quiet a long time before she spoke, and when she finally did, her voice had a texture I hadn't heard in years younger, less certain, more real than the voice she'd used at family dinners for longer than either of us wanted to admit. I didn't know what any of it cost you, she said. I should have asked. Yes, I told her. You should have. We didn't resolve everything on that call. We didn't pretend to, but it was the first conversation in a long time between the actual people involved, instead of the versions of ourselves we'd each been presenting. By spring, I was back in the garage most evenings, working a piece of curly maple I'd been saving for a rocking chair, not for the baby shower, not for any occasion at all, just because Lo mentioned once that her knees had been giving her trouble getting up from the porch swing, and a good chair solves problems nobody has to ask twice for. She stood in the doorway most nights now with her tea, watching me work the way she has for 40 years. And some evenings, she'll say she's glad we went, and I'll tell her I am too. And that's enough. That's always been enough. Claude responded. The people who love us quietly rarely announce it, they just show up, again and again, in ways we don't notice until much later. The people who love us quietly rarely announce it, they just show up, again and again, in ways we don't notice until much later. A good marriage, a good family, isn't built on grand gestures, but on small, unspoken sacrifices someone kept track of, even when we didn't. So call your parents this week. Ask them what it really costs to raise you. You might be surprised how much love was hiding in plain sight. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lesson still finds a warm place in your heart.